Witchcraft, Exorcism and Mesmerism, by Joseph Patrick JKL. Witches are commonly thought to wield supernatural powers, in the form of magic, usually for evil purposes. Because of this association with magic, the word sorcery has long been synonymous with witchcraft. Witches are usually regarded as possessed of devilish spirits, or under the guidance of some undetermined compulsion. However, a sorcerer was viewed as an ordinary person, using willful techniques to harm other individuals, perhaps resulting from ill feelings, or perhaps due to a grudge. Belief in witches dates back to prehistoric times, and there is no single description that applies to all societies that have believed in them. They are most often thought of as offensive, older-aged women. However, there are also references to beautiful young females, and, also, males, who are known as warlocks. In Europe, witches are often thought of as thin and bony, similar to the evil witch depicted in The Wizard of Oz, with her black robe and hat. In Central Africa they are depicted as fat, because they are thought to eat human flesh. In Europe, they have the power to fly around on broomsticks. In Central Africa, they fly in saucer-shaped baskets, and often rely on animals to assist in their evil deeds. The Witch of Oz had flying monkeys. However, in Europe, they used cats, dogs and sometimes weasels. In Japan, hyenas or owls. In Africa, baboons. Some witches can even turn into animals. Historical records reveal that the belief in sorcery and witchcraft existed throughout Europe and the Near East, throughout ancient times. In Greece, Homer wrote about witchcraft, and one of the ancient Jewish documents, the Old Testament, also makes mention of sorcery, and this crime was often punishable by death. In Greece and Rome, only witchcraft activities intended to be harmful were punished. Even level-headed Germans believed, and feared, witches. Christian attitudes concerning witchcraft change over the centuries. Many came to regard it as simply superstition. Other church leaders, however, condemned it as evil, and requiring punishment. During the witchcraft craze, in Europe, occurring in the mid-15th to the mid-18th centuries, witches were seen as drawing their powers from Satan. Christians continued persecution against witchcraft and thousands of people were convicted and executed. Some estimates put the number as high as 9 million. In the year 1692, the famous trials at Salem, Massachusetts, saw 19 people executed by hanging. Many see this as the end of the witchcraft hysteria. Researchers have long noted the many similarities between mesmerized people and people thought to be possessed. In fact, these same phenomenon have been produced in various other ways over the past 400 years. Religious influences. Catholicism was often guilty of instigating persecution towards witchcraft. The Church claimed that these techniques were immoral, because people were in danger of losing their free will. Another aspect was the heightened sexual arousal that women experienced. Since witches were considered to be possessed, it is understandable that the Catholic Church was involved. Throughout history, exorcisms of possessed individuals were performed by church exorcists, using ancient rituals dating back to the Old Testament. In the 15th and 16th centuries, those prosecuted for demonic possession received little mercy, since they had freely chosen to be under Satan's influence. But by the end of the 17th century, the Church discontinued viewing possessed individuals as criminals and began viewing them more as victims. Torture was frowned upon, and many more people stepped forward and began confessing to being either possessed or under a spell. In the last 20 years of the 18th century, and the beginning of the 19th, some witches were actually viewed as messengers from God. And, in the 19th century, Mesmer introduced the world to animal magnetism. He mesmerized the world with his therapeutic successes. Magic and superstition were in decline, and the evil forces of the witches were now being viewed as medical tools. The Church did not protest. At least, not yet. The signs of witchcraft. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, the people of Europe typically agreed that the devil could possess a human body. It was a universal belief that spared no social classes, and everyone was absolutely sure that demonic possession was real. Once it was determined that a possession was, in fact, real, then, the next step was to determine whether the possession originated with Satan, or, with one of his heralds, that is, like a sorcerer, or another witch. The possessed person was first tasked to identify the offender, and, if they would, then they would be spared the exorcism ritual. Next, the individual was asked to describe the possession. This was a dangerous moment, because the individual was made to look like he or she was responsible for the situation. If this was determined to be true, then there was no avoiding the exorcism ritual. For more information about the procedures of exorcism, see the 15th century book Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Sorcerers, by Kramer and Sprenger. The 6 signs of witchcraft. The 6 signs of witchcraft were identified as follows. 1. The ability to read minds. 2. The ability to speak in other languages. 3. Being able to foretell the future. 4. Increased intelligence. 5. Increased strength. 6. Ability to defy gravity. For the next 2 centuries, these 6 signs of witchcraft actually became the hallmark of a new science called animal magnetism. The viewpoint from the medical community. If a sickness could not be cured, then it was commonly considered that the reason was due to possession. The medical industry took a very pompous attitude, and contended that it was able to cure any disease that was not connected with the supernatural. People who had disorders like epileptic fits or nervous diseases were prime candidates for the accusations of possession. The exorcism ritual. Typically, the accused was considered to be innocent, but, if the accusation was initiated, then the person had no choice but to go through with the trial. They were made to respond to accusations like 1. The eating of newborn infants. 2. Sexual relations with the devil. 3. Their ability to change into animals. 4. Spreading disease that the medical industry could not cure. 5. Being able to levitate. Next, a physical examination was conducted looking for marks that could be attributed to Satan. Markings and muscle spasms were looked for, and then, signs of nymphomania, that was demonstrated by insensitivity of the vagina. But, the inability to find a physical sign of the devil meant almost nothing in determining one's innocence. The Loudun possession. The Loudun possession is one of the most famous in history. It took place in France in 1632 when an entire convent became demonically possessed. Following 2 years of reported possessions at the convent, Dr. François Pédux investigated, and wrote, the following. Quote, "They are delirious, they shout, they laugh, they cry, they show a very long tongue, they profess obscenities, they utter curses, they provoke many fights, they whirl violently, or observe, standing still, they roll on the ground, they rotate on themselves in complete convulsions without suffering much, they are seized in ecstasy." To questions presented and repeated in Latin, they answer appropriately in their own language. They remain motionless, very stiff, stabbings are not felt, and they are barely breathing, lying as if dead. Unquote. This trial generated controversy like no trial in history, up to this point. The nuns pointed at a priest from the parish of Urbain-Grandier as the devil's emissary who initiated the possessions. How it began. The Ursuline convent was in Loudun, France. In the spring of 1632, rumors could be heard in the nearby towns and villages concerning the strange events happening there. Some nuns said that they were seeing ghosts, while others were speaking vulgarities. The possession rituals were performed twice daily, for 7 years. In the end, Father Grandier was burned alive at the stake. However, termination of the strange events did not occur with his death. In fact, They persisted to the point that funding had to be stopped by the royal court of France. The nuns ended up being scattered to different regions over the next 5 years. The symptoms. Note the following eyewitness accounts. 1. Quote, in their drowsiness they, the nuns, become as flexible, as malleable as a strip of lead. Their bodies can be bent, in many ways, forward, backward, to the side, even up to the point where their heads touch the ground. They would stay in the position that they were placed, until we changed that position. Unquote. 2. Quote, the first demon that came up, at the command of Father Elize, having put her asleep, rendered her as flexible as a strip of lead. Following that, the exorcist bent her body in many different ways, frontward, backward, and on both sides in such a way that her head nearly touched the ground. The demon left her in such a way that her head nearly touched the ground. The demon left her, in that posture, until, the position was changed, and, during that time, which was quite long, she did not breathe by the mouth, but had short, nasal breaths. She was also nearly insensible, since the father pierced the skin of her arm, from one side to the other, with a needle, without her bleeding, or, showing any feeling. Unquote. The animal trials. As an interesting byline, many animals were brought to trial because they were considered to be Satan in disguise. At that time, people believed that animals had will, reason, and memory. But not to the extent of humans. Records of animal trials can be seen as early as the 12th century, and, as late as the French Revolution. Animals that were convicted of wrongdoings, were grouped together in jails, as though they were human. Costs were provided by the state, and, there was no discrimination between species. In the year 1120, the Bishop of Lyon, France, excommunicated caterpillars that infested his region. He used the same exorcism rites typically used to excommunicate humans. In 1454 a bishop in Switzerland sued the leeches that lived in the water supply of the city of Bern. The leeches were then excommunicated when they did not appear in court. In 1552, a plague of rats were prosecuted in a village called Dautun. In 1720, a female donkey was accused of being an accomplice to murder in a village called Vanvers. These are only a small sample of the many animal trials which occurred, and, it gives us a view of the society, plus the prevailing thoughts that people had, concerning witchcraft, and religion. In the 1800s, the signs of witchcraft were no longer being viewed as witchcraft, but rather, as signs of God's intervention into the affairs of man. Phenomenon, like analgesia, amnesia, and physical feats, were the trademarks of these religious fanatics. The medical industry needed to explain these phenomenon, and put labels on them, like theomania, demonomania, hysteria, and melancholia. Some physicians recognized the mind-body connection, and the significance of the imagination. Also recognized was the human tendency to imitate those who were important in their lives. Mesmer. Friedrich Anton Mesmer, also called Franz Anton Mesmer, lived between 1734 and 1815, the time of Napoleon. He was a physician from Austria, born in the vicinity of Constance, Germany. His ideas were responsible for the concept of animal magnetism, also called mesmerism. His birthday was May 23, 1734. He was from a large family of 9. His father was a forester, employed by the Archbishop of Constance. Upon reaching his 18th birthday, Mesmer received a scholarship from the Archbishop when he decided to become a priest. He studied at the Jesuit University of Dillingen, in Bavaria, where he studied, in particular, science and astronomy. He studied law for 1 year in Vienna, and little can be found concerning his life during this period. In 1760 he finally made a decision that medicine was to be his lifelong passion, and established himself as a physician in 1766. At the age of 32, Mesmer wrote a thesis on diseases and how they are affected by the planets. This resulted in his medical graduation. Mesmer married a member of the aristocracy, Maria Anna von Bosch. Through her, he lived a life of prestige and glamour, and frequented with famous people like Mozart and Gluck. He appreciated music and played the glass harmonica. The medical establishment, at that time, was still in the dark concerning surgery. The prevalent medical treatments of the day were bloodletting, leeches, cupping glasses, and herbal remedies that often had violent effects. Magnets and electricity came into vogue, and became the preferred treatments of Mesmer, at least early in his career. Just as the Orientals had determined, Mesmer thought that human illnesses were caused by obstructions occurring inside the body. One hallmark of his medical procedures was relieving the bowels. Later in his career, Mesmer believed that magnets were not a primary cure for illnesses. In 1773 he wrote, quote, "I have observed that the magnetic matter is quite similar to the electric field, and like the latter, tends to propagate itself through intermediary bodies. Steel is not the only matter that can be used. I have magnetized bread, paper, silk, glass, leather, wood, different metals, rocks, men, dogs. In short, everything that I touched, to such an extent, that it produced on patients the same effects as the magnets. I have filled up bottles with magnetic matter in the same way that it is practiced with the electric fluid." Unquote. In the late 18th century, Franz Anton Mesmer revealed a new method for treating illnesses. Animal magnetism was first theorized by Mesmer in 1775. He believed that there was a universal power that permeated everywhere. He also thought that this force could be directed for the purpose of curing the sick. Mesmer attempted to distance himself from spiritualism. Mesmer and magnets. Mesmer believed that the reason that magnets contributed to curing diseases was due to the fact that the magnet concentrated the universal fluid into the body. He did this by placing the magnets in the vicinity of the illness. The universal fluid would collect and heal. The magnets became of less and less importance in Mesmer's life, and he ultimately believed that the magnets had little to do with the cures, and that other instruments could also be used to concentrate the universal fluid. To demonstrate this point, Mesmer stopped using magnets in his medical practice in 1776. It is interesting to note that Oriental medicine also believed in the universal fluid that Mesmer discovered. He tells of an event that took place during his childhood in which he witnessed a physician draining blood from a patient, and observed that the blood flow increased, or decreased with the distance the physician separated himself from the patient. Mesmer believed that this was a special talent, and that he too had these same qualities, as demonstrated by other healers of that time. The historical records indicate Mesmer did achieve remarkable successes when the medical community were stymied. Even though the annals show amazing results by Mesmer, it must also be noted that Mesmer was not always 100% successful. However, it was always reported that significant effects were produced in many of his patients. A professor of physics at Ingolstadt, and a critic of Mesmer, named Stagelmer, had to admit that Mesmer could indeed elicit a nervous crisis in patients. He reports a nervous disorder in a friend, who had been plagued with it for 7 years, that was actually made worse by mesmerist passes. He claims that he himself had tried it on his friend. Quote, "I could renew his paroxysm at will, with my hand, with my finger, with a mirror, with my foot, etc., until one of my friends, witnessing the event, distracted the patient, directing his attention to different ideas. At this point the operation and the power I had, ceased. I was therefore convinced of what I should think of all this thing." Unquote. This is reminiscent of modern-day energy healing, and the methods employed when tracing the meridians. One meridian in particular has to do with the immunity system, and, when making a laying of hands in one direction, it has the effect of increasing the immunity system, but, when tracing in the opposite direction, it has the opposite effect. Based on his success rate, Mesmer's popularity and fame increased quickly, even with the opposition of the medical establishment. Father Gasnor. Mesmer, in 1775, met Johann Gassner, a Catholic priest known for his proficiency at exorcism. In fact, it was discovered that Mesmer's treatments were quite similar to the methods Father Gassner used in his exorcisms. In approximately 1750, Father Gassner developed headaches and dizziness. He enlisted the help of the medical establishment but to no avail. He was religious, and observed that his symptoms would flare up right before Mass, therefore he suspected that Satan was attempting to possess him. He tried exorcism, which resulted in his symptoms going into complete remission. His popularity grew after he became a successful exorcist in his parish. When Father Gassner made reference to himself, he labeled himself simply as an exorcist. He believed that diseases came in two forms: 1, those which were natural and could be treated by physicians, and 2, those that were beyond the abilities of physicians to treat, because they were supernatural. Of course, supernatural diseases could only be treated by the Catholic exorcism rite. Father Gassner had a screening procedure for patients. He wanted to see if the symptoms were natural or supernatural. If Satan revealed himself during the screening, then the rituals would begin. Exorcisms could be draining to all involved, lasting from hours to several days. The Exorcism of Emily. Emily was the daughter of an officer working for a well-known German gentleman. She was 19 years old, and, for more than 2.5 years, suffered from involuntary muscle contractions for several hours every day. She saw her local physician who successfully treated her muscle contractions. However, she still suffered other symptoms like headaches, stomach aches, and certain feelings of melancholia. She sought help from Father Gassner and was willing to travel 150 miles to see him for treatment. Gassner evaluated her and determined that the girl was under Satan's influence, and that the previous medical diagnosis for her sickness was wrong. He demonstrated by commanding Satan to manifest himself in Emily's right arm, right foot, and left foot. And Satan complied. He then told the devil to make Emily scream, turn her eyes upward, and suffer severe muscle contractions. Emily convulsed for more than a minute. Father Gassner stopped the display by proclaiming the Latin word, cessit, which means to stop. Up to that point, Father Gassner had only spoken German. However, when he said, cessit, everything returned to normal. This was interpreted as a sign of possession, because one of the tests of demonic possession was the ability to understand unknown languages. Emily reported feeling much better after the screening, so Father Gassner considered her a good candidate for an exorcism. The event was highly publicized and more than 20 credible witnesses appeared at the ceremony. Before commencing the exorcism, Father Gassner demonstrated that Satan was present, because he was able to coax muscle spasms in different parts of the body. Each time he said the Latin word, cessit, the spasms stopped. Father Gassner went on to demonstrate how Satan had the ability to control Emily's internal organs. He increased her heartbeat, decreased it, and caused it to go into irregular palpitations. Next, it was revealed that Satan could also control her emotions. She was made to laugh and to cry. Then, Father Gassner demonstrated that he was able to manufacture pain in different areas of her body. Finally, he showed how Satan could affect the senses. That is, Emily lost her sight and her hearing as soon as Father Gassner ordered it. This report ended with 12 upper-class men swearing to its veracity. Father Gassner always spoke to Satan directly and not through Emily, and this depersonalization technique influenced Mesmer's treatment of patients. Father Gassner became very popular, but was looked upon with caution. The Prince-Elector Max Joseph, of Bavaria, appointed a commission of inquiry which asked Mesmer to appear as an expert witness. Mesmer wrote in a 1781 book that Father Gassner possessed a great amount of personal magnetism. He wrote, quote, "I said that he was obtaining genuine effects, but he did not know the real cause. I repeat it here." Unquote. Father Gassner retired in a small community. As per church authorities, in 1779. It is interesting to note that curing the sick was not enough. One had to cure in a way that was acceptable. Mesmer, and the blind girl. The medical community denounced Mesmer, and were forever thorns in his side. His animal magnetism theory was rejected by the Academy of Sciences in Berlin, which said simply that his findings were in error. In fact, they refused to even study the memorandum he had sent to them. As recorded in Mesmer's 1781 book, quote, "This young lady was 18 years old. Her parents were well known, she was herself known by Her Majesty the Queen Empress, she was receiving a pension from her, because she had been totally blind since the age of 4. The cause of her illness was a complete guttusarena. Her eyes projected out of their sockets, and were convulsive. She was also melancholic, suffering from liver and spleen obstructions that triggered such delirium and anger that one could not but think of madness. She had taken all sorts of medicines, she had suffered uselessly through more than 3,000 electric shocks, she was treated for more than 10 years by the physician von Storerk, without success. She had been declared incurable by the Baron de Wenzel, a physician occultist living in Paris who had examined her in Vienna, upon the request of Her Majesty. If one had to look for an obvious cause of blindness, Teresa Paradis was the best example. I gave her back her eyesight. 1,000 witnesses, among whom many physicians, and von Storerk himself, accompanied the second president of the faculty, and some of his colleagues came to appreciate this new demonstration and testify to its truth. Teresa Paradis's father himself thought his obligation was to render these facts public in all Europe, and published the details of this interesting cure. His letter can be found in my memoir, titled, Sur la découverte du magnétisme animal, translated from German. It looked impossible to deny such well-proven facts. Nevertheless, M. Barth, a professor of anatomy for the eyes, and a cataract surgeon, succeeded in proving it had never happened. After having witnessed twice at my home that she was in fact able to see, he denied it in public. He dared to say that he had checked her himself, and that Mademoiselle Paradis was ignoring or confounding the names of the different objects presented to her, a simple and unavoidable fact for a person whose blindness goes back to infancy. That one more person would join the association between Ingen Hus and Father Hell did not trouble me much. Truth was pointing to the extravagance of his contentions. How ignorant I was of the resources of an envious person. They attempted to withdraw Mademoiselle Paradis from my care, while her vision was still imperfect, to stop her from appearing in front of Her Majesty, and prove in such a way that it was a hoax. To succeed, they had to worry M. Paradis. They made him believe that he would lose the royal pension if his daughter recovered her vision. They persuaded him to take her back from me. At first he acted alone, then, with her mother. The resistance of the daughter, however, made her suffer bad treatments. The father tried to use force, he entered my home with his sword. By the time we had disarmed him, both mother and daughter had lost consciousness. The former out of anger, the latter, because her savage mother had thrown her head first into a wall. Although I was freed from the mother in a couple of hours, the fate of Mademoiselle Paradis really worried me. Continuous convulsions, vomiting, and tantrums returned. She was as blind as before. I was afraid for her life, or at least for her brain. I did not think of revenge, which I could have, in terms of the law. I thought only of saving this young unfortunate woman who was still under my responsibility. With the help of the people who had encouraged him, Paradis alarmed the whole of Vienna with his protests. I was the subject of the most outrageous slanders. The too easily convinced M. von Storerk commanded me to send Mademoiselle Paradis back to her parents. As she could not be moved, I kept her for another month. In the first 2 weeks, I had the pleasure of restoring her eyesight, as it was before this incident. In the last 2 weeks, I showed her what to do to restore her health and keep improving her vision. The excuse that M. Paradis presented me, the thanks expressed by the mother to my wife, and their promise to send their daughter back each time I would judge it necessary were all but a lie. Granting them the benefit of the doubt, I allowed their daughter to go to the countryside with them. I never saw her thereafter. It was obviously necessary for her eager parents that this unfortunate person stayed blind, or, at least look like she was blind. That is what these cruel people were working on. In this way, Jinhus and his associates had their own triumph." Unquote. This affair had much significance in Mesmer's life. Subsequently the Empress sent him a note ordering him to stop his trickery. Upon analysis, a few things are noted. 1. Mesmer kept the girl for a month following an order that she be released into her parents' custody. 2. The father presented himself with sword in hand, but did not use it to liberate his daughter. And 3. The father made public statements that Teresa's eyesight had, in fact, been restored. His statements reveal that his daughter's vision had been at least partially restored. In fact, the father was far more enthusiastic than Mesmer in this recognition. It turns out that the father, M. Paratus, believed that the recovery exhibited by his daughter was so extraordinary that he requested Mesmer to announce it to the public. It seems that there were plots and conspiracies directed towards Mesmer, as Father Scoberti writes in his 1839 book. The priest also supported many of the points that Mesmer wrote about in his letter. The Jesuits. The Jesuits are a powerful faction of the Catholic Church, and much has been written concerning their conspiracies to control the Church, and world in general. They are often thought of as a secretive order that controls from the shadows. A Jesuit council convened and decided that Mesmer would be continuously harassed and that the concept of magnetism would be prohibited. Quote, "Since we had failed to retain it for ourselves." Unquote. This council actually stated that the congregation would do whatever was necessary to prevent the girl from regaining her eyesight. But, exactly what was the reasoning here? Were the attacks meant to prove that Mesmer was a charlatan? Or, that one would pay a dear price should they oppose the Church? So, in 1778 Mesmer leaves Germany to take up residence in Paris. However, for 3 months prior to his departure, he went into seclusion to organize his thoughts and materials into formal methods of treatment. He would reveal his animal magnetism to the world in the following way. Quote, "The object of my discourse cannot be expressed in an objective manner. If I want to be understood, I have to use images, comparisons, approximations. Animal magnetism, as I use it, is akin to a sixth artificial sense. Senses cannot be defined or described, they have to be felt." Unquote. It is interesting to note that France did not roll over and just accept Mesmer's concepts. The scientific community in France saw them as old ideas. Medicine based on magnetism could be traced back to the 1500s. But, Mesmer made his concepts unique. He stated that there were 2 types of magnetism. 1. Mineral magnetism, and 2. Animal magnetism. Mesmer also believed that a person's imagination could be affected in 2 ways. The first comes from within, with attitude determining efficacy. The second comes from person to person, and its success is determined by how much belief the person places in the abilities of the other person. It was actually the imagination of the patient that was curative. It was the imagination that allowed the subject to imitate the healthy state, suggested by Mesmer. Benjamin Franklin was asked to investigate animal magnetism, and the Benjamin Franklin Commission, in 1784, issued the conclusion that imagination and imitation were the major elements of Mesmer's successes. Mesmer in Paris. The medical establishment showed great interest in Mesmer's works, and he was invited to a dinner by Baron d'Holbach, which included many famous people in the literary world. At this dinner he was unable to demonstrate his concepts. It is reported that ever since this unfortunate setback, he never returned to the Baron's house. Disputes ensued, regarding his findings. And, his relationship with the scientific community devolved to a point where they would mount attacks on his integrity. Nevertheless, Mesmer's popularity soared in Paris, and Mesmer experienced enormous popularity. People from all social groups traveled to his home for purpose of witnessing or experiencing his therapies. Mesmer's personality. Mesmer was a tormented soul. On the one hand, he was obsessed by his accomplishments, but, on the other hand, he was unable to document or explain them in a systematic scientific manner acceptable to the medical community. He isolated himself to exclude his wife, friends, and colleagues. Mesmer typically complained, in his writings, that his wife was indifferent to his discoveries. He described her as dull and unimaginative. Mesmer's state of mind can be discerned in the following paragraph from his 1781 book, just prior to arriving in Paris. Quote, "A feverish passion overwhelmed my senses. Love did not guide my search for truth anymore. I was anxious. The countryside, the forests, only the most secluded places attracted me. There, I felt closer to nature. Extremely agitated, tired of nature's useless invitations, I sometimes rejected her with violent anger. O nature, would I say in my crisis, what do you want of me? Other times, to the contrary, I imagined embracing her tenderly, asking her, impatiently, enthusiastically, to surrender to my wishes. Fortunately only the trees could witness the vehemence of my accents. I certainly looked like a maniac." Unquote. Mesmer loved and was comforted by music. He was a gifted and accomplished musician. He had no close friends and exhibited paranoia due to hostile and dishonest attacks on his character. When reading Mesmer's own words, two characteristics obviously dominate: 1, he placed high value on honor, and 2, his total devotion to his work as a therapist and humanitarian. Charles Dislin. Charles Dislin belonged to the Paris medical faculty and was the first physician appointed to the king's brother. This man befriended Mesmer and became his companion and student. He was instrumental because of his excellent reputation and contacts in high society. Dislin learned to revere Mesmer and became his primary promoter. It seems as though his high esteem was unlimited. He advanced and became an excellent student and enthusiast of animal magnetism. He provided Mesmer's clinic with so many patients that they ran out of room for them all. Ultimately, they had to move, and, finally settled on the Hotel Bullion. It was a large space, that could accommodate people who needed to stay for extended treatment. It had fountains, an orchestra, gardens, 4 wooden tubs called baquettes, and a magnetized tree for the benefit of the poor. Passing of the hands. This mesmeric technique of the laying of the hands had been practiced by faith healers since antiquity. Present-day medical personnel actually take courses in these techniques. The infamous touchings were the subject of sexual impropriety and immorality. But, from all indications, these passes were always gentle and slight, and never do we see instances of long and heavy massages that were claimed by Mesmer's enemies and critics. The Baquet. The Baquet stood out as a visual representation of mesmerism, and provided an economical means of treating multiple patients at a time. Mesmer, however, stated that he would have done away with them if he had greater resources, because they were not required in the practice of animal magnetism. A typical patient would arrive at the clinic and be led to a relaxing room, where lighting was decreased and heavy drapery hung on the wall. The room contained a covered oak, wooden structure. It was 1.5 feet high and 6 feet in diameter, and multiple people could sit at the baquet. It was hollow on the inside and contained water, broken glass, and iron fillings. The container had a lid on it that was made of wood that had multiple holes in it. Out of these holes projected rods of different lengths that were made from iron or glass. Everyone was placed in a seated position, and a loosely attached rope was connected to each person and then returned to the tub. It was thought that animal magnetism circulated through participants prior to being directed into the baquet. And then the magnetist used techniques to direct magnetic fluid through the rope. Note that the magnetist had to be included in the chain. How effective were the baquets? Mesmer related that different people exhibited differing degrees of susceptibility to being magnetized with the following statement. Quote, "I have noticed also that not all men can be equally magnetized. Of 10 persons that were present, there was one who could not be magnetized, who stopped the communication of the magnetism. On the other hand, there was one of these 10 persons who was so susceptible to magnetization that he could not approach a patient within 10 feet without causing him tremendous pain." Unquote. One of the signs of magnetism was a release of bowels, probably due to an intense state of relaxation. New patients typically felt very little unless Mesmer himself came to treat them. However, repeat patients related many different types of reactions like sweating, yawning, laughing, shivering, etc. Sometimes patients would shout, cry, fall asleep, or lose consciousness. If Mesmer himself were conducting the procedure, he would disappear into the shadows and play his glass harmonica. Fully, 1/4 of his patients experienced a complete crisis, and others did not experience anything remarkable. The cure depended on the patient experiencing the crisis. It should also be noted that the effects of magnetism vanished when the diseased organs were cured, because, in healthy individuals, the effects are minimal. The manifestation of crisis was unmistakable. Crying, moaning with pain, violent muscle contractions, and intense hiccups. The worst cases were shuttled to a special crisis room, where Mesmer would attend to them personally. The demise of Mesmerism. Throughout history we can see the same methods used over and over, to discredit those who opposed conventional thinking. Even Abraham Lincoln was known to litter the countryside with anonymous pamphlets to discredit his opponents. Anonymous books and pamphlets are injected into society to influence the thinking of the general public without having to provide proof of allegations. More than 100 books and pamphlets were written in 1784, which claimed to demonstrate the inability to duplicate Mesmer's findings. Mesmer was attacked mercilessly by his enemies and critics in 1784, and this could be thought of as the demise of Mesmerism. The primary attacks focused on sex and impropriety toward women, which became the talk of the town, and spoken about in cafes and theaters. Of course, of the multitudes of women that sought cures, there was never any impropriety that was ever proven. To illustrate what Mesmer was up against, the following anonymous poem was widely circulated. Quote, "Even if the bucket is so widely used, it cannot also cure a particular discomfort that can only be alleviated in a private rendezvous. Then magnetism becomes the celebration of love. And now my hero, charming and magnetizing, behind a locked door will dissipate this burning sensation. He knows what to do to make this cruelty vanish, and never his blessed finger encounters rebellion. O sweet ecstasy! O languorous sights! The holy bucket of pleasures is the throne. Let yourself go, charming things, under the magnetic hand. Don't listen to all the foolish critics. Come, don't be afraid, my hero is discreet. He never tells what he does at the bucket." Unquote. The prevailing thoughts about women concern the weaknesses of the female mind, and how they would succumb to sexual advances if they attended Mesmer's clinic. In an anonymous book, it was stated that Mesmer did for love what Newton did for the world system. The author wrote, quote, "That is why any woman desiring to retain her virtue, will avoid the presence of those who desire her, because she knows that by being repeatedly magnetized, she could not prevent herself from succumbing to the laws of attraction. You will certainly agree that those who are inexperienced, careless, or so foolhardy as to expose themselves to it, will become its victim." Unquote. Mesmer and his science was ridiculed everywhere, even in the theater, with plays portraying him as a seducer of women and having no social value whatsoever. It was circulated that Mesmer only employed young men with sex appeal to massage the women, who were connected to the magnetic tubs. Many pamphlets, articles, books, and plays ridiculed Mesmer during 1784. But, it must also be noted that many defended him. However, The final straw that broke the camel's back was the indignity Mesmer had to endure when he attended a concert sponsored by the Queen, in which a blind pianist captivated the audience. Mesmer again became the center of attention, and it can be argued that this was the most embarrassing moment in his life. This woman was the same Mademoiselle Paradis that Mesmer failed to cure of her blindness back in Vienna. By the end of 1784 his popularity receded, and he was no longer in vogue. The Commission of Inquiry. The king ordered a commission of inquiry into animal magnetism in March of 1784. 9 of the most famous scientists of the time were on the commission that Benjamin Franklin headed. Members of the commission researched animal magnetism, and part of the investigation was to attend a famous mesmerist clinic daily. The following was reported, quote, "Nothing is more surprising than to witness the convulsions. If one has not seen it, it is difficult to imagine what it looks like. When one witnesses them, one's surprised by the deep rest in some of the patients, agitation in the others, different accidents that repeat themselves, and the likings that develop. One can see patients looking for each other, running toward each other, smiling and talking affectuously, trying to soften their mutual crisis. All are submitted to the magnetist, even when they are apparently sleeping. His voice, his gaze, one sign awakens them. We cannot but recognize in the constancy of these effects the great power that seems to agitate and control these patients, and of which magnetist seems to be the possessor." Unquote. Mesmer's student, Dislin, wrote the following commentaries, quote, "If they had told me before that they would limit themselves in such a way, I would have told them how insufficient a means they were taking. I would have told them that only a small proportion of patients experience instantaneous and noteworthy effects, that a lot of patients are cured without experiencing any effect, and that among those who experience the immediate action of magnetism, its effects vary infinitely." Unquote. The commissioners concluded that the imagination is the true cause of the effects attributed to the magnetism. The commission also concluded that mesmeric techniques were dangerous for many women. The morality issue again came up when Mesmer was attacked by the commissioners with the statement that women could lose their health and their decency. It is interesting to note that through all of the allegations of immorality, never was there a case of abuse documented. And, with all of the enemies and critics that Mesmer had, it is reasonable to assume that if they had such evidence, one of them would have been more than happy to publish it. The Royal Society of Medicine Report. Shortly after the results of the Franklin Commission were reported, the Royal Society of Medicine published its report. The conclusions were similar, however one of the participants refused to sign the report and published his own conclusions separately. Laurent de Jussieu could not accept rejection of animal magnetism because of the effects that he had witnessed. He believed further investigation was required. This commission determined that the effects of animal magnetism varied depending on the nature of the disease. It was found that diseases of undetermined origin had the greatest benefits and that the benefits were not due to magnetic fluid but rather to the patient's hopes for a cure, rest, exercise, and abstinence from medication. Criticism of the report. 1. The Royal Commission rejected the idea of evaluating the successes and failures of magnetic treatment. 2. The Commission stated that they would ignore any phenomenon that occurred within themselves. And, one of the commissioners did experience a mesmeric crisis during one of his visits to the clinic. 3. The Commission rejected the effects experienced by people of the lower classes. Mesmer's final years. 1784 and 1785 were disastrous years for Mesmer. Many books were published which claimed to reveal the secrets of mesmerism. Mesmer caused rifts among his own disciples by criticizing many of these books and ended up leaving Paris. He finally established a residence in Switzerland where he wrote his final book in 1799. After his death. In 1820, animal magnetism gained acceptance in Russia, Germany, Denmark, Prussia, and Sweden. Conclusions. Mesmer was an honorable man who had the best of intentions at heart. If he would have played the games of society, he would have undoubtedly endured less condemnation. When someone sticks to his ideas and beliefs, and refuses to be swayed by the ideas of others, then he or she will have to accept the consequences. In this world, ideas of one person will always conflict with the ideas of others, and, if one of the persons is not aligned with powerful people, then they are easy targets for slander. In all fairness to the opponents of Mesmer, many were probably as adamant in their beliefs as Mesmer was in his. Mesmer's downfall was not his enemies but rather his personality. He was not social and therefore unable to rally the high society that he needed to defend his ideas. In retrospect, it is obvious that Mesmer elicited responses that have been noted throughout history. Faith healers, psychics, mystics, and shamans have used these responses to bring about apparent miracles since the dawn of history. People are confused by the contradictions of life. They feel that it would take a lifetime to investigate just a few of them. So they give up responsibility for their thoughts and opinions and give in to the experts. Of course, the experts only present facts and conclusions. But the significance of the facts still must be interpreted. Since people are social creatures, they try to duplicate the thoughts and ideas of those people they respect and whose opinions they value. For instance, if someone flatters me, then I will be more likely to accept one of their viewpoints, because I identify with them. If they like me, then they must be somewhat like me, and if they are like me, then they probably have many similar thoughts. In this way, ideas float around society and influence people. The ideas of people who have obtained a lot of money are often valued more highly than those who have not, because one's success in life is measured by the material goods one attains. However, the materialistic ideas of wealthy people are not infallible, and often, they are in outright error. Mesmer's problems began with his personality because he was withdrawn, and did not easily bend to the ideas of the upper class. He felt that the cures he provided would stand on their own and provide a shield against slander. Of course, he was wrong. People create the worlds they live in, and they are unique worlds based on their beliefs. If I promote an idea that is opposite to another person's beliefs, then, automatically, I am putting myself in opposition to that person. Now, I could go to that person, sit down in a friendly manner, and discuss our differences. While showing respect for his or her ideas, I may be able to elicit a friendship based on respect, providing that I show him, or her, that our ideas are not really opposed, and that there are many things that we do agree on. However, if I never meet this person, and if people he or she respects comes to him speaking of the foolishness of my ideas, then this person will be likely to accept those views without giving mine a fair chance. I believe that this is what happened to Mesmer. The ideas that can be traced back to Mesmer can actually be considered as the beginnings of hypnosis, psychology, advertising, and other mind sciences. Mesmer was unable to formulate a theory for his results that would be acceptable to the medical and scientific communities. He further complicated matters by keeping these people at a distance. History was not very kind to Mesmer. Today his name is associated with quackery, immorality, and evil. Someone who attempted to control the minds of others and take away their free will. All of the evidence suggests, however, that Mesmer was an honorable man whose primary interest was to help people and to bring his methods to the world. But should we feel sorry for Mesmer? Probably not, because he never wanted for money. He lived to be 81 years old in a time period when the average age was approximately 25. And in a letter dated 1809, Mesmer wrote that he was living a quiet and happy life. He died March 5, 1815. End.